I'm delighted to be doing this. First of all, this is a brilliant book. It would be a little bit tougher for me to do this evening if I hadn't really enjoyed it, but I did really enjoy it. And if you haven't read it yet, you should. It's a great, unusual example of a polemic, stylishly told polemic, with all the force and vigor that implies, with close argument and substance. And so it's a really a great read. It's great that we're talking about it this week. Yesterday, David Cameron, former Prime Minister, formerly of Oxford, came back to government, was appointed Foreign Secretary by the Prime Minister, formerly of Oxford, Rishi Sunak. Cameron, probably more responsible for the parlous state of our country than anyone, but he's a bloody good chap, and that's all that matters. I just finally, before we get to the main event, this is a particularly delicious opportunity for me because I didn't go to Oxford, and I'm extremely chippy about it. As my wife will tell you, my wife did go to Oxford, and she likes to kind of needle me about it, and I sort of relish any opportunity to give Oxford a good kicking. There's a kind of joke about people who went to Oxford or Cambridge, that they tell you, usually within 2 sentences of meeting you that they've been.
I wrote a whole book about it.
Yeah, I'm also I'm really impressed that you waited until the second paragraph before telling us. So I think we should start by. Can I ask you to summarise? I could do it myself, but can you summarise the kind of argument of the book, and then we'll get into it.
That's a terrible question.
Sorry.
Well, it starts the night of Brexit when I'm watching in my living room in Paris, just aghast. This terrible thing that obviously wasn't going to happen has happened. I'm sure American listeners here will recognise such a moment. And I'm watching all these people who've done this to us parade across the screen, or who failed to prevent it, like Cameron and Osborne. And then the kind of villains of the piece, Boris Johnson, Michael Gove, Daniel Hannan, Jacob Rees-Mogg, and I'm seeing all these people and I think, I know exactly who they are. I remember some of them as teenagers, strutting around town. They all went to Oxford, either with me or just before me. I know where these people come from, and then that gave me this feel, I know where this thing comes from as well. And so the book is not about why 17 million people voted for Brexit, because they all had their own reasons and were told different stories or held different stories in their heads. The reason is why this political class decided to offer it to them, because of course politics is also about we talk a lot about demand, what people want, but there's supply, which is not exactly responsive to demand, but can often lead demand. So why did the British political class decide to supply the option of Brexit? And so this caste then split over Brexit. So Cameron and Johnson they're not exactly the same caste, because Cameron is more upper class than Johnson, and they both know and feel that very intimately. But they knew each other as teenagers at Eton. Johnson had contempt for Cameron, because Johnson saw himself as the poor boy striver and won all the kind of, held the glittering roles at Eton and Oxford, whereas Cameron just loped along because he was so posh that he didn't need to prove himself in any way or need to network. And then, so they go through Eton and Oxford, and they split over Brexit, and this group of people splits over Brexit. But they are, in their origins, identical on the Conservative side. And then there's also the Labour side, who I suspect and hope will be coming to power in a year, which is also very largely an Oxford production. It's a different kind of Oxford, because there are different Oxfords in the same place. Broadly, there's a posh Oxford and a middle-class Oxford. There isn't really a working-class Oxford, except for a few people. But the more middle-class, more strivery Oxford congregates in the political members of it congregate in the very small Labour club, and disproportionately then become the Labour leadership. So Keir Starmer and Boris Johnson leave Oxford in the summer of 1987. I'm sure that Starmer knew who Johnson was, because everyone knew who Johnson was. Johnson probably didn't know who Starmer was. Anyway, that's sort of what the book is.
And I want to get into some of these narrative threads and some of the characters in a minute, but let's just zoom out a little bit and talk about the concentration of our elites and how that compares to other countries. I mean, I kind of had a vague idea that, you know, lots of people in power went to Oxford or Cambridge. I hadn't really confronted quite how many of them did till reading this book. Just kind of figure after figure, you go, oh God, they also went to Oxford.
And knew each other.
And they all knew each other. I was like, wow. Now, so that seems like a very kind of constricted bottleneck to power. Tell me, seeing as we're here, how does it compare to France and how does it compare to the rest of Europe? What's the variation?
Well, you have a few Western countries, chiefly the UK, the US, and France, which pre-select their elite at 18 based on a kind of rigged system that pretends to be a meritocracy and has elements of meritocracy in it. So it's a kind of mix of meritocracy and privilege, but presented as meritocracy. And in the UK and the US, the university you get into at 18 is very determinate of your potential to rise to the top in fields like law, some degree business is a little bit weirder, in Britain politics. And in France they do it more age 20 or so when you get into ENA, so 4 of the last 6 presidents have been to the Golden National Administration, which has now been, they say abolished, but really renamed. And these are outliers because in most of Western Europe and in Australia and Canada, where you go to university is not terrifically important. Universities on the whole are not very selective. If you finished high school in the kind of top stream, you go to university and nobody really cares. And I saw a version of this because I grew up in the Netherlands and left at 16, but my friends from school went on to Dutch universities and it didn't really matter where you went. And there was a kind of mediocrity over the whole system. And in those countries, your success and your chance of reaching the elite depend on what you do as an adult much more. So do you do well in your job? Do you get lucky? Do you meet the right people? University matters much less. So US, UK and France are outliers in the West.
It's so interesting because I had always kind of grown up with this idea that I thought all countries had elite universities, you know, 2 or 3 universities or a few universities at the top, and then everyone's kind of trying to get to those. And also that this was a vaguely kind of good thing. And actually your book kind of turns that on the head. There's something to be said for a kind of widespread of mediocrity in education. That's not quite the word, but you don't need to kind of have these super brilliant...
Yeah, I mean, it's absurd to pre-select the elite age 17, and in the day I'm describing, the 80s, it was highly dependent on whether you'd been to private school because there was no sense of, hang on a minute, you're being very impressive at this interview. I wonder if Eton coached you for the interview. And so it was extremely skewed towards private school men, and you could say in modern jargon that was a feature, not the bug. That was it was meant to be like that. Oxford and Cambridge had always had the job of ferrying posh boys to power.
Yeah, I did actually apply to Oxford. This hence my chippiness. Really getting kind of psychodrama of my life here. I went to a comprehensive where the minority of kids went to university, let alone Oxford. So I was kind of defenseless.
East London somewhere, right?
South East London. And I remember being in the interview, really just dealing with these kind of very kind of stuffy old men in this stuffy old place and not knowing what to do. And then the phone rang. It took me a while to realise that was my cue to just go. You know what I mean? Like, he didn't even say, oh, I'm so sorry. It's just like, picked up the phone. And I was just sitting there for a while going, oh, okay. It's the end of the interview. So I'm interested in just get like in the kind of the sociology of the upper class, which you kind of traced from the 80s, actually through the 20th century. But broadly speaking, you'd say, you know, the upper classes had learnt to be quite kind of lazy throughout most of the 20th century. They could just kind of coast on their status. But then in the 80s, as Britain generally got under Thatcherism more kind of competitive and meritocratic in a way, they kind of woke up and started working harder, and which in a kind of way kind of made the problem worse.
Yeah, working harder for little bits of the education. So, you know, Boris Johnson got into Oxford for Latin and Greek. At the time, 2 out of 3 people applying for classics, as the degree was called, got in. So admission rate was quite high. There were only a very few schools in Britain that taught Latin and Greek at all, so you were only really competing with other public school boys. And you had to work, you remember what it was like, around A-levels when you're 18, you do a few months of working a little bit harder. And then at university, people congregate in the bar and whine about how hard they have to work. And then around finals, they take speed and work hard. So it was never a hugely high-pressure system. But what changed after the 70s, a lot of the upper class never bothered with university because you were going to run your landed estate anyway, or go into the city, or go into the military, which were all professions where university was frowned upon. And so Nigel Farage is an example of that. Public schoolboy, goes to Dulwich, not academic, so goes straight into the city. So it was only a minority who really bothered with university, and then university was not seen as very hardworking. But it's true that from the 80s, kind of your credential becomes more important. And Eton says, right, okay, you want us to produce people who go to Oxford and Cambridge? We can do that. And so they switch to even the dumbwits have to get into Oxford and Cambridge. And then I'll coach the interview where someone like you is kind of unleashed, like, good luck, old chap, and no instruction.
And presumably it becomes a kind of global competition as well.
Yeah, later. So in the 2000s, especially before Brexit, all the elites of Germany and the Netherlands, less so France, because they think, well, the French elite is obviously the highest thing that a human being can achieve. And so a lot of the 18-year-olds from around Europe start to apply as well. And what you see in any British field is that as soon as the foreigners appear as competition, the number of native British people shrinks remorselessly. And so that's where Oxford was kind of heading in 2016. It was becoming a European elite university. Of course, that has now been reversed. So it's mostly British 18-year-olds plus Chinese 22-year-olds and American 22-year-olds paying, $30,000 each or whatever it is.
And what kind of education did Oxford give our ruling class generally? So and your book is quite nuanced on this. You say that there were people doing incredibly hard work and deep work in science, physics, so on.
And in the humanities, a few people. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Sure. A few people also in the humanities, but generally there was a kind of you could get away with a less
rigorous approach.
Less rigorous approach.
The thing about education at Oxford, it was voluntary. So if you really wanted to work hard, and there were quite a few people who do, let's say 10 to 20% of the university were really devoted to their subject or had such severe personality disorders that this was the only outlet available to them. And so they got really fascinated, and you can literally procure every book ever published in the UK in Oxford. You just go to the Bodleian Library and ask for it, and a couple of hours later it's at your desk. The education is really geared around one tutorial a week, typically of 1 hour. Maybe you had 2 tutorials a week in certain subjects. And it's you alone or with one other student with the tutor, and you read out your essay if the tutor is lazy, because that takes up 20 minutes of the hour so the tutor can get through. And if the tutor's eager, you've sent the essay in before. And then you spend an hour discussing the essay with the tutor. And it was almost always he at the time, points out the flaws in your argument, and you try and argue your way around them. So it's coaching and verbal dexterity about a subject about which you don't know very much, because you're 19 and you're hungover and you played football yesterday. You have many other things on your mind, and the tutor is an expert on the subject. So it's a mismatch. But there are people in British politics like Dominic Cummings, like Ed Balls, who became Labour Chancellor, Andrew Adonis, who I met at the FT, who intimidated the hell out of me because he was the first person I met at the FT, and we had lunch on my first day. He was my boss. And I was sitting there during lunch thinking, is everyone in the building as clever as he is? Oh, my God. And it turned out not. And so that's why Andrew is quickly recruited to be a cabinet minister. And so people like that, they went to Oxford, they thought, this is amazing. I can be with a tutor and just have the best education in the world and spend the rest of the week in the library. And they did. And then there were people like Boris Johnson who figured, not really important. I knew this woman in my year. I was doing history in German, she was doing history. And she was very working class person at Oxford. She'd grown up in Stoke, one of the poorest towns in Britain. She was very bright, but getting into Oxford was way above what she'd ever imagined or expected or wanted in life. And she just thought, right, this is a massive bonus. I'm here. I've discovered I don't have to do any work. And what she did is she chose all the subjects in history that she had done at A-level at school, and pretty much read out her A-level essays, maybe with a little bit of editing. And she got a 2-1, which is a norm degree in Oxford. So also it's because if you can write well, and she then later became a very successful romance novelist, weirdly, or like Boris Johnson, or less well like me, you become a columnist. The system is geared, the exams are geared to people who can write essays well, which of course is the jobs that people like you and I went to. And so it was not so much a test of knowledge or understanding, but a test of writing ability. Thank God.
And allied to that, the culture of the Oxford Union encouraged verbal facility, verbal brilliance.
Rhetorical dazzling, yes, for politicians. So when I began the book, I thought, well, Oxford and Cambridge produce the political elite. Turns out, no, Oxford produces the political elite.
That was remarkable to me. I hadn't really noticed that.
Yeah, and conversely, Cambridge produces the dramatic elite. So there's a review in Cambridge in 1981 with Emma Thompson, Stephen Fry, Hugh Laurie, Rowan Atkinson, all in the same review, and various other. And so, yes, if you're 17, you went to public school and you think, well, I'm going to be Prime Minister, which is a very reasonable expectation if you went to Eton. It's not a big leap. Why not? And then you go to Oxford because you've heard, which I hadn't realised because, you know, I'd mostly grown up outside the country. You know about the Oxford Union. The Oxford Union is a debating society where kind of underinformed students do dazzling competitions of wit and dexterity. Boris Johnson became president of the Oxford Union. Michael Gove, Theresa May did not succeed in becoming president, etc. So they all go there. Then they network there. They meet each other there, and then they all kind of go in a procession to Westminster.
So that brings us quite nicely, actually, to the kind of white-hot centre of this, the clown in the middle of this, which is Boris. So talk a bit about your kind of impressions of Boris and how he kind of embodied some of these themes that we've been talking about.
So Johnson left in 87, I arrived in 88, so sadly we did not overlap. But Johnson was a scholar at Eton, so Eton always had scholars, but they tend themselves to be quite posh boys who have been to prep school, which is a kind of private school, elementary private school, and there they take the clever boys and they train them up for the Eton exams. And so Johnson passes the exams. He goes to Eton as a King's Scholar, age 11, and he's very bright, I think, as an 11-year-old. And he's also very verbally gifted. And somewhere in his adolescence, he realizes, I'm the most charismatic person at this school. I'm also the most ambitious person because the toffs are not very ambitious. They frown on that. And he sees himself as not a real toff. I told this friend of mine who was at Eton with him, who was also a scholar, I said, do you know that Johnson was not very posh? And he said, well, he seemed posh to me. And so Johnson is posher than 99% of the population, but if you're at Eton, you're not comparing yourself, you don't really care about 99% of the population, you're comparing yourself to people like Cameron, who is properly posh. And so Johnson thinks, I'm more ambitious, I'm more charismatic, so I'm just going to stop thinking, and I'm just going to do this kind of rhetorical performance. So he plays a version of himself from the age of 15 in every performance, this kind of scatterbrained Bertie Wooster type. And so he takes that through Eton, and he's very popular, he's captain of the school, and he has this clique of hangers-on, and he goes to Oxford, and I think 150 Etonians were at Oxford in his era, so he knew everyone. His best friend at Eton and at Oxford was Lord Spencer, Diana's brother, so he's very much in that world of posh people, not quite of it. And at Oxford, he does the act, the Bertie Wooster Act, takes it to the Oxford Union. At Eton, they have a debating society, so most people who arrive at Oxford, including me, and including almost all the women, and almost everyone who went to state school, which at the time was half the university, had never debated. You know, nobody ever told you didn't know how. And so you didn't know when people shouted, point of order, point of information, what they meant. But if you went to public school, you knew exactly. So it's monopolized by a few of these toffs who like debating. Johnson does the Bertie Wooster Act and fails once to become president, becomes president of the Oxford Union. And so he becomes the kind of star Oxford figure. He marries the most beautiful woman in his year, obviously only briefly. And then he comes out and he goes into journalism. All the, most of the chums in my book, they go into journalism because what can you do if you can speak and write well but you don't know anything? And you want to do something in London, obviously, because there's only one city in the world after Oxford. So yeah, that's broadly the Johnson thing. The Bertie Wooster Act, which people say, once you'd seen it a third time, it wasn't quite as funny anymore. And the whole British population was taken through that experience.
Yeah. So and the interface between Oxford and the Conservative Party was incredibly porous. So the Conservative, MPs and ministers would come and visit Oxford, and they would kind of identify risers and coming men.
They would speak at the Union. Yeah.
And there's a fantastic quote from Christopher Hitchens where he says, the good thing about being at Oxford was I got to meet some of the people running the country early on and realised how bloody thick they were, and that was really invaluable for me in my career. But yeah, but it's almost, it is a kind of, you know, conveyor belt, or it was, between those institutions.
Yeah, and so the Conservative Party is very stratified by class in these ways that in any British institution it is, but you only quite understand it once you're inside it. And so there's a fast track if you're Eton and Oxford. And so David Cameron applies to Conservative Central Office as a research department after Oxford. Central Office gets a call from Buckingham Palace, an unidentified man who says, I'm calling you from Buckingham Palace. I've tried to dissuade David Cameron from going into politics. He has refused to listen to me. You are about to meet a very impressive young man. So Cameron gets the job. Now, Michael Gove, who is a lot brighter than Cameron, also a leading British politician of the last 20 years, also applies to Conservative Central Office and is told essentially to bugger off. Because Gove is an arriviste in the British system. He did go to a private school in Aberdeen, but essentially his parents were fishmongers, so not right for Conservative Central Office. So most people in the Tory party in Parliament are not that posh, but it's the poshest people who congregate at the top of the party.
Yeah. And there is kind of these interesting, interesting is not really the word, but kind of rivalries, petty rivalries between these guys, which actually have kind of great consequences, particularly between Johnson and Cameron. How did Johnson see Cameron?
Well, he saw him as a kind of entitled posh boy, which is, of course, how most people see Johnson. And in his world, that was true, because Johnson thought, how come he gets to work at Conservative Central Office and not me? There was nobody from Buckingham Palace calling for Johnson. And so Johnson also has this flaw that he lies all the time, which is an advantage sometimes, but a flaw often. So he was sacked from the Times almost immediately for lying. Yeah. Now, what we see with Cameron returning to power as Foreign Secretary is Etonians get second chances. So most people, if you manage to penetrate the top of an institution, either through luck, guile, or quality, and you screw up, you're out. So if as a 21-year-old you're hired by the Times, and then they sack you for lying, that's kind of it. Yeah. So 2 weeks later, Johnson is working at the Telegraph, because he'd met the Daily Telegraph editor when the Telegraph editor spoke at the Oxford Union, Max Hastings, et cetera, et cetera. Cameron has now been given a second chance as well. It's like you take a football team from the Premier League to the 4th Division, and then 7 years later they call you again.
And let's just dwell a little bit on the connection between Oxford and Brexit, because it's not obvious that Oxford, this concentration of power in Oxford, would lead to a strong, Brexit campaign. Quite a few of the people we're talking about, in fact, were very kind of passionately Remain, including, of course, Cameron. So how do you see the causal relationship between Oxford and...
Well, I would say Cameron was dispassionately Remain. So yeah, and most people who went to Oxford and most people who were in some kind of politics in Oxford were probably Remainers in 2016. What we're talking about is a particular caste, and I've tried to define this caste as, the best definition is boarding school. So 7% of the UK population goes to private school, but only 1% goes to boarding school. Boarding school is pretty much the best demarcator we have of being upper class in Britain. So the British upper class have this very weird pedagogical belief, which you won't find in any book about child raising, which is the best way to raise children is to send them away at age 6 and live in an institution where nobody loves them. And I think the reason this is done is because the message to the child is, you are a member of our family, sort of, but you're more than that, you're a member of your caste, and you will live in this caste, and you will marry within this caste, and your whole life will be spent in the 1%, the boarding school upper class. And so you need to meet your fellow caste members early and be initiated into the rituals. And so the people who went to boarding school, and it was very largely boys, because girls from that class, at the time, there was no need to educate them. I mean, what are you educating them for? They're just going to marry a boy from the caste. So they weren't taught to debate. Their schools were not taken terrifically seriously. Often they weren't even sent away. Too much bother. And so it's really boys from this caste are given the message, right, well, you're living in this terrible boarding school and you're being beaten and often sexually abused, but you will run the country one day, which in the historical memory of this caste means you will run the world. And so then you get to the top, you arrive in London after Oxford. Everything has gone according to plan, as they told you. You're on track to run the country, and you realise this country doesn't really matter much anymore. My father and grandfathers ran the empire, were in world wars, and now we're going to Brussels on the Eurostar to argue with the Latvian environment minister about plastic bag use. And so it's very unglamorous, and it's quite shocking to everything you had been told was your future is a very tatty version thereof. And so I think that was the emotional appeal of Brexit. The emotional appeal was going back, not for the 17 million who voted, some of them certainly, but not most of them, because most of the 17 million were never told you're going to run the UK. Their role in life was to be angry at the people who ran the UK. But the people who offered Brexit, they had this disappointment that their caste no longer particularly mattered. It still mattered in Britain, but what's Britain?
Let's talk a bit about your relationship to Oxford and how you feel about it. I mean, there's a sort of a thread in the book of, I don't know, a slight sense of guilt, or you certainly give a lot of thought to your own privilege and as relates to Oxford. But you kind of had one foot in and one foot out of the establishment. You came from a comprehensive school, middle class background, but you didn't have a bad time at Oxford. You got along, and just give me a kind of flavour of your relationship to it personally.
Well, when I got there, when I was finishing school in London and applying to Oxford, I was barely British because I'd been born in Uganda, did 10 years of school in the Netherlands from 6 to 16. And at 16, just after my parents moved back, I joined them in London, finished school, and I didn't feel British. I didn't really know many people. I'd barely been outside London in the country. And so I didn't really have class hang-ups either, because my parents didn't really feel British or feel they belonging to a particular class. So when I arrived at Oxford, it was very interesting. I met all these British people who came from places I'd never been to, like Stockport or Hampshire or Northumberland. And I realized that most of them were crippled by some kind of class anxiety, that they felt inferior. A lot of them, their families had risen in the world over 30, 40 years, so their parents were of working class origin and had more working class accents, and the child had a middle class accent, and the middle class person thinks, I don't belong here because there are lots of Boris Johnsons here. Actually, there were only a few, but so there was a lot of people walking around class anxiety. I didn't feel any of that. And I arrived, I met lots of nice people and bright people, and I had a great time, and I played sports, and I wrote for the university newspaper, and made friends, fell hopelessly in love. All these things that you do as a student, and I thought it was wonderful. And in my last year, I began to work very hard, and I really enjoyed the work when I started to do it. So I was both at the beginning a waster, and then at the end a serious student. So I experienced both ways of doing it.
And you never felt intimidated by the aristocratic caste?
I never really met the aristos because they didn't really have any cause to meet me, because they were overwhelmingly men, and so they were posh men who already had a lot of mates, the posh men they'd been to school with or who had been in their caste and they'd visited on, caste home visits. And then they wanted to meet attractive women. So middle-class women, attractive women were plucked out and invited to their parties, which obviously I was speaking to a woman of that description at my age who said that she felt very uncomfortable about that because she realized, she said, that she was seen as totty and was invited sort of for one reason. But so they had reason to want to meet her, but they didn't really have particular reasons to want to meet me, and I didn't have particular reasons to want to meet them because most people I knew were middle class and I liked them and I was fine. I barely knew that there were these Boris Johnsons around, and I wasn't, because I didn't feel my own class in the way that British people did, I wasn't that worried about class. It just wasn't a hang-up I particularly... I had hang-ups, but that wasn't my hang-up.
Yeah, we won't go into your hang-ups now. We can if we've got time, if you have questions. But actually, before we get to questions, let's just spend a couple of minutes talking about the last part of the book where you talk about what is to be done about this. I mean, obviously, my solution is pretty simple. I would just burn it to the ground, abolish Oxford University altogether. But you have some interesting ideas for how to tackle this.
Yeah, so I said they should stop undergraduate teaching at Oxford and Cambridge and keep graduates who are doing, on the whole, serious work, or if they're Chinese and Americans, at least paying a lot of money to the university, and create an Oxbridge for all. So go and find really good, motivated, intelligent people throughout Britain. You're 48, you didn't go to university the first time around because you didn't come from that class or because your life wasn't in that place, or you're 22 and you're ferociously bright and there is a subject you really want to study, maybe it's social work. We will take you for 3 months or for 2 years, whatever it is, and we will give you fantastic training in that thing. I was very inspired by a film called Educating Rita with Michael Caine about adult education, and Oxford and Cambridge would be fantastic locations for that, and they have the teaching resources, and I would love them to do that. So I said they should abolish undergraduate teaching, and I've been invited back to Oxford 4 times or so since the book came out to give these talks, and people who work at the university hate the idea. But to my immense surprise, they have actually reformed themselves. So I thought this is never going to happen. But Oxford and Cambridge have done this extremely radical reform where now about 70% of students admitted are from state schools, which is the highest in the history of the universities. And they have these algorithms as disadvantage that they use when you apply. So did you go to a school where lots of other people apply to Oxford? Were you on a free school meals, which is this British thing? Parental income, were your parents immigrants? Are you caring for somebody at home? So instead of at your Oxford interview being asked about your gap year in India, you might be asked, well, we see that you're caring for your mother in Rochdale. Tell us about that. And so they've totally turned the system on its head. Oxford now has significantly more black people, black students, than the UK average for black people in the population. Oxford has some fantastic proportion of students from disadvantaged backgrounds. So I never thought they'd do it. Oxford is now majority female for the first time in history. I never thought they'd do it. But in 5 years, I think partly embarrassed by Brexit, which was obviously one strand of Brexit was an anti-elite uprising, admittedly led by an elite. And so the elite institutions in Britain, from the BBC to Oxbridge, feel under tremendous pressure to reform and become inclusive. So whereas American universities remain total kind of, rich people's fortresses, in the UK they haven't done that.
Yeah. America hasn't really tackled this problem.
No, it doesn't want to. I mean, there are some universities which are abolishing this kind of extremely corrupt system of legacies, where if your grandfather went to the university or your parents, you have this leg up, which is completely against meritocracy. But the main universities aren't tackling that. Yeah.
Fascinating. Okay, well, look, thank you very much. I think we should give you a round of applause before we take questions.
Thank you both so much for this fascinating discussion / dig of Oxford. As someone who also did not go to Oxford, I was thrilled. Do we have any questions in person in the audience first? We'll start here, and if you're on Zoom, send them in and keep them civil, please. Yes, I'm coming in the back. Let me bring you the microphone.
Thank you. So I guess I'm guilty of also saying I did my master's at Oxford, so I guess that confirms your idea of the book. But I think my question, I was very struck with the absence of the civil service. So for example, here in France, there's a lot of like a parallel civil service that's based also on its own system of prépa, polytechnique, and so on. Not to invoke Bourdieu, but like I was very struck by this idea of the absence of a parallel institutions that would produce sort of elites that would work in the civil service irrespective of political career.
But that's how the UK does work, yeah. There is an Oxbridge-educated civil service fast stream, they used to call it, where essentially lots of people apply to the civil service, and if you went to Oxford or Cambridge, then they put you in the fast stream. So what happened to you at 17, 18 determines your civil service grade for life. And so the country's always been run by the Sir Humphrey figure who, our great, in Sir Humphrey's phrase, our great universities, both of them. So these people are very Oxbridge-y and also try and control the minister, who also went to Oxford but didn't do any work there and just spoke at the Oxford Union. So, it is quite similar in that way to the French system, but what's happened in the last 7 years is the civil service lost control. So the job of the civil service was to sit on politicians, make sure they didn't do anything, which worked quite well. And then with Brexit, this thing happened that nobody in the whole civil service voted for. And then the populists emboldened thought, we can do a whole lot of other crazy stuff too. And when the civil service would say, well, Minister, that's an interesting idea, meaning that's batshit crazy, the Minister would think, oh, well, you're just an elitist. So the civil service is also Oxford, but has lost control.
Other questions in the room? Raise your hand. Yes.
I was interested in your comments about your own background. Our British son-in-law was at Eton with both the two gentlemen you discussed in detail. His impression was that Johnson's brilliance sort of carried the day, and that he abused that brilliance all the way. But two specific questions that you didn't address, and that is Johnson's 8 years as a popular mayor of London. That's quite an achievement for somebody who passes for brilliant, posh, and sort of vacuous. The other one is, how is it that European companies and U.S. companies have basically controlled electricity, roads, railroad, and banks in the UK? What was it about British competitiveness that allowed that to happen?
Sorry, which companies have?
American companies and French companies.
Oh yeah, they're
had
no
majority control of water, roads, and rail in southeast England.
Yeah, well, the entire corporate sector in the UK is dominated by foreigners, whether it's making cars or banks.
And American banks.
Yeah, and Japanese and Chinese banks. Yeah, no, I mean, story of British corporates in the last 50 to 70 years has been of total failure. First, the manufacturing sector failed. Nobody bothered replacing it because there was no need to make stuff in Britain. And then the banks and electricity companies, you do need some of that in Britain, especially because London had become centre of finance. So you just have foreigners taking it over. Occasionally they'll employ somebody who went to Eton and Oxford because the clients like it. But yeah, no, there's no role for British corporates. Johnson as mayor of London, I mean, Tip O'Neill said of Reagan he'd have made a great king. And Johnson wouldn't have made a great king, but he's better in ceremonial speaking roles than in doing roles. And Mayor of London controls transport. The thing about transport, it's not very big or complicated. There's not much change. It's central government decides about the money. So what you do is you have four what Johnson would have called spods or geeks, meaning middle class, hardworking people. And you say, you run the tube, and I'll go out and make the speeches. And Johnson, you know, he's moderately funny. And he got caught in that harness during the Olympics, and everybody loved it. And so he was quite good at being the face of London. And in a job where no policy is made, you know, he's not bad. However, when you're Prime Minister trying to write a quick book about Shakespeare because you're being paid, you know, $500,000 for it, and then a pandemic breaks out, about which you're so uninformed that you ask civil servants in all seriousness whether using a hairdryer up your nose might cure COVID, this is not quite the skill set that was required.
I was speaking to somebody who was working with him during COVID. There was a kind of interesting insight just into how his personality is, he projects himself in the room. She said he was a very unusual combination of alpha male and little baby, and that was quite. It was actually quite beguiling in a way when things weren't going chaotically wrong, which they were most of the time. But that was his kind of thing. He could be there. He could be the kind of big gorilla in the room. I'm the Prime Minister. You know, let's go. And 5 minutes later, have his head in his hands. I don't know what to do. Help me. Yeah, it was just interesting insight into his modus operandi. Anyway, who's got another question?
Just thinking towards the future, you mentioned, Simon, that there's sometimes a second chance for people like Cameron who've been to Eton and Oxford. I'm thinking of someone like Rory Stewart, who got ousted by Johnson for voting against it. But what does the future hold for someone like Stewart? Can they make a comeback? And is this kind of stranglehold going to be broken in the future?
I mean, Rory Stewart also went to Eton, but is a much more accomplished figure. And as my colleague Gideon Rachman says when I bang on about Eton, he said, look, the two greatest English thinkers of the 20th century were Orwell and Keynes. Keynes. And where did they both go to school? They went to Eton. So, that's not bad. I think Rory Stewart, so the Tories are going to go far right after the election, so there won't be a place for him there. So 5 years on, who knows? I think that Johnson did the kind of Bertie Wooster toffs a huge disservice, because British people will not vote for a figure like that for a very, very long time after this. Could Rory Stewart... I think for now he's in a party that is kind of in a doom loop of heading to the far rights, and there aren't enough votes there in a two-party system. He's got a good podcast. Yeah, so why would he want to be Prime Minister? Yeah.
I have a slightly different view on Rory Stewart. We can argue about it later, but I think he's a dilettante, and actually, I think he's much more similar to Boris Johnson than he likes to imagine, and that's why he despises him. Anyway, yes.
Hang on, wait for the microphone, please.
What is your prediction for Labour?
I think they will win, and they will be very unpopular, because it's going to be a really hard 5 years. There is no money for anything. And because Britain hasn't invested in public services for 13 years, these services are disintegrating slowly. So whether it's the trains or the health system, you need constant investment just to keep them sort of functioning. And there is no huge new wodge of money, which there was in '97 when Tony Blair was elected. The Tories hadn't really spent much money, but they had run the country not insensibly. So there's money in the bank. The economy was going all cylinders, so Blair put a lot of money into public services. So Labour is going to be overseeing deteriorating public services with no money. They're going to go to Brussels and say, look, this whole Brexit thing, we know it's stupid. What can we do to build relations a little bit? And Brussels is going to give them a list of things to do, which are not going to achieve very much, because essentially you have to join the single market too. And that will happen, but it won't happen on the short term. So I think things are going to be very tough for Labour. Also, charisma is really helpful. Johnson discovered it's not the only thing. Yeah. But Blair showed that if you have it as well, it's useful, and Starmer doesn't.
I think we had a question right next to this one. No? Other questions? Yes?
So you actually mentioned the figure I was thinking of a moment ago, which is Orwell. And I think there's a line or a section I don't quite recall from The Lion and the Unicorn, where he's talking about the role of the public schools in creating a sufficiently stupid ruling class to run the country in the appropriate way.
I must go back and look. I thought I had a total knowledge of every line of Orwell, but I've forgotten that one.
Maybe I fantasized this one, but it's one of the many Guardian columnists. There's probably Marina Hyde or John Crace, but talking about Cameron as the essay crisis prime minister.
Yeah, so essay crisis is an Oxford concept of
right. What's been the role of the education that Oxford provides in shaping the kind of governance we've had? I know you touched on it slightly, but I wonder if you have more reflections.
What Oxford gives you, even if you didn't go to Eton, is it arms you with the confidence that you can walk into any room where you don't know much about the topic and you'll be just fine. You can kind of bullshit away. You've read the 3-page briefing paper, or maybe you haven't, and you'll be just fine. So it gives you a very kind of a veneer of confidence and plausibility that especially impresses people who didn't go to Oxford, because they think, oh, well, you must know something, and look at the accents as well, really must know something. And the thing is, Cameron is kind of at the upper end of that. So I knew a civil servant who briefed prime ministers. And she said Blair and Cameron were great, because you give them the 10-page briefing, they're about to meet the Portuguese Minister of Agriculture, and you give them a 10-page briefing on what we need to get out of this. Not the Portuguese Minister, the Portuguese Prime Minister. What does Britain need to get out of this, or what do we want from the Arctic Treaty? Blair and Cameron read the 10-page briefing paper, go out and make exactly the case the civil servants had told them to make, and push at exactly the pressure points, and do total good job. She said Gordon Brown, much harder, because he'd read the briefing paper and he said, oh, well, there was a paper from Princeton in 2003 that totally negates your argument here. And the civil servants don't like that, because they know what the right argument is and they don't want the Prime Minister to. But Brown would have been a great economics professor. And Johnson didn't read the briefing paper. So a colleague of mine spoke to the Greek Prime Minister. So this is very Oxford as well. You go into the tutorial and on Charm you want to wing your way through, which is what Johnson has done his whole life. Just very briefly, a colleague of mine said to the Greek Prime Minister, you've met Johnson, what do you think of Johnson? And the Greek PM says, look, if you're meeting a fellow Prime Minister, there's business to transact. This is what the UK wants from Greece, this is what Greece wants from the UK. You've both read your briefing paper, you both know what you're supposed to ask for. You know what the other person's going to ask for, and you do a deal. And only the Prime Minister can do a deal, because only the Prime Minister can decide for the country. And the Greek PM says, yeah, but then you meet Johnson, and he hasn't read the briefing paper. So he comes in and he says, oh yeah, Greece, Homer. And he quotes a few lines from Homer. And the Greek PM says, well, you know, that we have this issue, the waters of the Aegean, you know, fishing. And Johnson says, yeah, very, very good. Yeah, I'll ask my people to. And so as a Greek PM, you walk away, you think that was a complete total waste of time. So he couldn't do the job that Cameron and Blair, to their credit, were able to do.
Also, I think that touches on a kind of clash of styles between British and perhaps specifically kind of Oxford approach to law and rules and the rest of Europe, particularly the EU, right? So I get the impression that in negotiations they were, they and are extremely systematic in their application of law.
If you talk to the EU, yeah.
And Boris the Boris style is more kind of, oh, well, come on, it's all nonsense, really, isn't it?
Well, in Britain, there is a logic to that, because there isn't a constitution, as we've discovered, and the Prime Minister essentially can make the law. If you, as the PM, have a majority in the Commons, if you want to make a law saying we'll slaughter the firstborn, there are not many obstacles to that. I mean, the Lords will say, well, do we really want to do this? But mostly you can get stuff through. So law is very fungible in Britain, whereas in the EU they say, oh, well, Treaty Item 47.3, and so, yeah, this whole rhetoric thing you're doing to me, it doesn't work.
This rhetoric thing you're doing to me, it's just a great phrase.
Hello, is it on? Is it on? Yes. Hello, thanks for that. My only concern with the, albeit extremely interesting and certainly entertaining discussion of the characters and character assassinations of people like Johnson and Cameron is that in looking at their experience at Oxford, we don't examine their kind of ideological formation. So, in other words, their ability to learn how to be bullshitters in meetings and walk into rooms without briefings. But I wonder if you could make any comments about perhaps your own time or about their time, in terms of the kind of intellectual formation that they have and the people involved in shaping their worldviews.
Yeah, I mean, in the book there is a fair bit about that. So it was the 80s, so Margaret Thatcher was transforming Britain, kind of away from a social democracy into a more Reaganite system. And the Conservatives thought, this is great. These lazy poor people, they should have their benefits taken away. And banks emerging in the city, good for us. So they were very pro-Thatcher, but she was a very rare politician who completed her project. So by the time she was kicked out in 1990, she'd kind of done the whole project of privatisation and tax cutting. And if you'd taken that any further, then Britain would kind of look like the US under Reagan or more. And so you couldn't really go any further, so that was done. So they were Thatcherites without a project, and the project became Europe, because when in the late 80s, Thatcher starts to realise, hang on, Europe is also a federalising project. She loved the single market. She co-created the single market. She didn't like a federal Europe that would take powers from Britain, because she was an old-style British nationalist. That's what she'd taken as a child from the war. And the Toffs also were very anxious about Brussels taking powers, because they thought, those are my powers. Those are my personal powers. I'm going to Parliament, and I'm going to be PM, and I don't want these kind of people with funny accents and technocratic jargon in Brussels taking my powers. So that wasn't the whole cast, but within the Tory Brexiteer cast, that was their project. Thatcher had deprived them of a project by finishing it. The Cold War had deprived them of a project, because this kind of standing up to the Soviet Union wasn't relevant anymore, and so Europe became their ideological project, except for Johnson, who didn't really believe in anything at all, but had a kind of emotional attachment to the British past. And I think the British past is the centre of their ideological belief system, that there's a kind of beautiful old British past which belongs to upper class people, and you see it in the Houses of Parliament, you see it in Oxford, you see it in the vicarages and private schools where they lived and grew up. And that must be preserved. And one very important book to me, which I reread and found it very poor and dull, during the writing was Brideshead Revisited. And the hero of Brideshead Revisited by Evelyn Waugh is the building itself, is Brideshead. And that's the kind of great old England that has to be preserved. And that, I think, is a big part of their system.
We have time for one more question. Yes?
A naive question, if I may. When I'm in meetings in England, I open my mouth and a condescending colonial smile goes around the room, all right? I was wondering to what extent the British representatives who were in Brussels, their lack of understanding of foreign languages, or their discomfort with foreign languages, being able to talk around the edges of the meeting with people in other languages than English, to what extent did that color their whole take on Brussels?
Yeah, I think you and I have talked about this in the past. So I think that's very important, because what Johnson and Cameron and Gove all had was they felt we have a superior command of English. So we speak English better than other English people, partly accent, partly kind of rhetorical style. And therefore we're the rightful rulers of the country. And which is a very odd connection. It's not how things work in the US so much. But then you go to Brussels and nobody cares, and everybody speaks this Globish, which is this kind of very functional version of English, which is not beautiful or pretty or nuanced or melodic. And so they felt a contempt for Globish, and they didn't think, oh, well, all these people are speaking in their second or third or fourth language to us in English. They just thought, these boring people, they can't make, you know, the kind of Oxford jokes that we make. So I certainly think that contempt for other people's language, which in the UK was about class, and with foreigners was about kind of, with Brussels and other foreign interlocutors was about this Globish.
Can we have a final round of applause, please?